Okay, hi again. 310. Dr. Conley, Instructor Conley, chatting at you for the second time. We are now in Module 2. We are in the 20th century. We spent last week looking at the foundational voices, theories, what I'm calling the models of rhetorical theory. So hopefully the focus this week, and as you're thinking about the paper that's due Sunday, is primarily on those models. The way to think about the models, the four main models, is that they correspond to sort of four of the most crucial figures of ancient rhetorical thought. And they are kind of ideal types, right? So, you can look at Aristotle's rhetoric or Plato's dialogues on rhetoric, and you can pull out of that a way of thinking about rhetoric in terms of a kind of ultimate formulation. And as we proceed, you'll notice this week I've structured the little breakdowns along the lines of these isms. So the first one, we've got Neo-Aristotelianism, Neoplatonism, Neo-Ciceronianism. So what that's suggesting is that in the 20th century, you have the continuation of these traditions. When I teach the survey course, which I'm doing also online right now in 409, we go through the whole history of rhetoric, and we track these four different traditions. And basically the idea here is that these four main legacies, traditions, models are pretty much what exhaust the universe of possibilities in terms of rhetorical theories. So it's not like anytime you find something that's Neoplatonist or Neo-Aristotelian, it's exactly that, but that's the closest approximation. Sorry if you hear that noise, that's my printer. Periodically it cleans itself, so I'll just hang on a second while it finishes up. Very noisy printer. So I don't know if you can hear it. I assume you can. It's right there. So shut up. It wants to keep going. I'll just talk louder. Okay. So that's the kind of the structure for the different eras that we're moving through. There we go. So we're looking at the 20th century this week. We're looking at three of the main traditions. The fourth tradition is going to be our final 3 weeks of the semester. That's the Neo-Sophistic tradition. But the idea for this week is that some of the major movements that were happening in the 20th century rhetoric, the kind of resurgence of interest in rhetorical theory, sure enough falls along the lines of these other three major traditions. So a couple of the major rhetorical theorists of the 20th century, Chaim Perelman and Stephen Toulmin, are very much in the Aristotelian tradition. Another major figure is Richard Weaver. He's a Platonist. And the biggest figure in the 20th century is Kenneth Burke. And I have him under Neo-Ciceronian, but as we'll see, he can also probably be considered sophistic in some ways. So that's what's happening this week. And the idea is to just give you that sense of grounding in these four major schools of thought, I guess, in terms of concerns about rhetoric. Now, we've covered all of that last week. I got that video, I've got notes and everything, so hopefully you're okay on that, because, of course, that's what the paper's about. So if you have questions about that, catch me in the chat room, come to my office, let's get cleared up. But in terms of this week's readings, I'll just quickly talk about each of them, just briefly, just kind of hit some high notes just to make sure that we're grounded, I guess, in terms of the big stuff moving forward here. So I posted an article by Lucades and Condit. It's the introduction to a reader that they put together called Contemporary Rhetorical Theory. Now, it's a little bit older, but it's still a pretty good introduction in terms of what was happening in late 20th century. The major themes that I would point out there, the way that new technologies and media technologies completely transform the kind of social landscape of the 20th century. Basically, the idea here is the kind of democratization of voices being able to reach far and wide, getting more voices into the mix of public discussion. So there's a kind of populism that we're seeing happening in the 20th century where, the radio, television, eventually, of course, the internet and now cell phones and so on, we have increasing amount of voices, whereas before, there was more singular kind of dominant blocks of voices, right? So 20th century, we see an explosion of new technologies, new voices, new concerns, new values and value judgments and so on. That's big stuff. It's very socially disruptive. As you see in the reading, it's recommended, but I do encourage you to take a look at it. They also talk about the explosion of invention. So thinking about the rhetorical canon, after the ancient period, especially going through like the Renaissance and the early modern period, so like, from the 15th up through the like 19th, early 20th century, rhetorical invention was really sort of not talked about much, not written about much. That old Aristotelian notion of invention as sort of the coming up with your proofs in a world of probabilities, that got pushed to the sidelines, and the moderns were fascinated with science and logic and reason, and so they were very much interested in certainty. And because rhetoric doesn't get us certainty, they weren't interested in rhetoric. So rhetoric kind of returns in the 20th century. That's why they often refer to it as the new rhetoric of the 20th century. Perelman and Obrecht-Stieteke's major book is called The New Rhetoric. It was published in the 1950s, and it's called The New Rhetoric. And it's a massive book. And they were doing what a lot of people were doing at that time, Toulmin as well, rediscovering rhetoric. And you'll see if you read that when you read the intro or the beginning of the Perelman essay, he kind of talks about that process of him learning about the old ancient history of rhetoric and kind of discovering, oh my goodness, everything was there essentially, right? So he sort of admits his indebtedness to the Aristotelian tradition. So invention in particular comes back as a major concern of rhetorical theory in the 20th century. This idea of how we come up with ideas, how we come up with meanings, how we come up with knowledge, how we come up with truth, how we come up with, the available persuasives, as Aristotle would say. This is hugely, hugely important to all kinds of scholars across the humanities in the 20th century. And so rhetoric's back. It's an important part of the kind of broad scholarly conversation about social life, political life, cultural life, influence, meanings, language, all of that stuff. So from its origins in the ancient world, jumping into the 20th century, we see two major periods of rhetoric's flourishing, whereas in most of the other periods, it's diminished in terms of its social power, I guess. So invention's important. And you'll see when you look through Perelman, I'd say Perelman mostly, but also a little bit of Burke when you kind of squint. Perelman's all about invention, which how do we come up with our ability to reason and argue with one another? It's hugely about invention. The Lucchese and Condit piece also talks about the return of the probable over the certain. So when I say that the modern, who we're not reading, but the modernists from the 16th to the 19th century roughly, they were obsessed with certainty, right? Logical certainty, deductive certainty, the syllogism, science, ironclad logical proofs and so on. The 20th century moves away from that, and he actually gets back to the realm of the probable, which is the realm of Aristotle. It's the realm of like people tend to do things more or less of the time, or we can rely on something more or less. That becomes an important way to think about social problems, right? Is like, something might be more or less good, more or less bad, more or less true, more or less untrue, but we can still reason about that stuff, and that's important, as we'll see. So that also means that rhetoric is involved in situatedness, right? So what is true and reasonable and forceful in this situation matters, as opposed to what might be useful and meaningful and forceful and reasonable in another situation, right? So we're thinking about the probable, we're thinking about rhetoric's situatedness. What's working here, now, not what needs to work across the board. So that's important. And they also talk about the postmodern, which I'll get back to in a second here. But there's a kind of period of transition in the 20th century where we're moving out of the modern world into the late modern or postmodern world. And rhetoric's involved in all that. But we'll get back to that with Burke. So first, how am I doing on time? 10 minutes. All right. Try to do this in about 15, 20 minutes. So Perelman, that reading is just a shortened version of the new Rhetoric, which is, as I mentioned, it's this fat, massive book. And so the reading that we have, the new Argumentative Rhetorics reading, the new Rhetoric mini version, is most of the big contributions of the major work just shrunk down into a single article. So it's really good and handy piece, I find. And like I said, the intro, the beginning of that piece is a useful kind of summary of this. It's along the lines of what Lucchese and Condit are doing. It's a kind of summary of, the history of rhetoric and how that moment that they were writing is really looking back on that history and learning from it, right? So when we say the new rhetorics of the 20th century, we're thinking that these are, I think of it as like rhetoric sort of 2.0, or maybe 3.0, depending on how you slice things up. But it's not like a completely different take on rhetoric, especially with Perelman and Toulmin. This is deeply, deeply Aristotelian in its spirit and in most of its letter, in terms of like what it's actually up to. So, it's an interesting kind of continuation after a long 300 years so kind of shift where rhetoric didn't matter so much, or if it did matter, it was just thought of as like, theater or acting or voice modulation or whatever. So now it matters in an important way. Again, they also talk about values. Now, the key thing to think about here, I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this, but in the modern period, from the 16th to 20th, early 20th century, whatever, there was this kind of split between what is fact and what is value. And there's a hard split. Something is empirically true and factual, or it's subjectively true and value-laden, right? So it's this radical separation of like reason and emotion. And when you do that and you say that rhetoric does not necessarily deal with facts and reason, but also deals with emotion and subjective experiences of speeches and so on, then you can see how rhetoric was set aside because the moderns were more interested in the facts and the reason and the logic, and rhetoric was not part of that. But now, with Perelman's big question was, how do we reason about values? He comes out of the juridical background. He was a philosophy student who was interested in how it is that we, socially speaking, reason about values in legal situations. And he found that most of the writing on this question rejected any consideration of values, therefore rejected rhetoric altogether. But Perelman basically discovered you can't even begin to think about how people reason with one another in a legal context without thinking about the question of values, and therefore thinking about the question of rhetoric. So it was a subtle but really profound move to say, let's think about how people reason using values, across values, with values, right? Think about our big social controversies today, whether it be guns, abortion, free speech, technology issues, privacy issues, whatever. It's all values, right? So rhetoric's an important part of how it is that we convince and defend and reason across all of these debates. You need to be able to think about values. So that's important. Also, the concept of presence is really interesting. It doesn't fit in, in a major way in terms of the specifics of what they're up to, but the idea of presence is really useful in terms of thinking about what rhetoric does, which is to make something present, right? If you want someone to be thinking about how much trash they throw away, you should take all that trash and dump it on their living room floor, right? That makes it present. So rhetoric is this process of making issues present. How do you do that? How do you make something pop, vivid in the mind of the audience so that they can sort of smell it and feel it and sense it? That's the idea of presence. There's a lot of other stuff in that reading, more along the lines of the specifics of how it is that we reason with each other about and through values. We don't need to get bogged down in the specifics of that, but I do want you to get a handle on sort of the way that Perelman was, borrowing from that Aristotelian tradition to think about the kind of the argumentative moves that are made on a daily kind of common basis, where values and sort of civic questions are very much at the center of our exchanges. Okay, so moving into Weaver, hopefully it's clear very quickly that Richard Weaver is a Platonist. He's actually as close to the original as you can get, really. He's very Platonist. He writes about his admiration for Plato, and he borrows a lot of Plato's ideas. So he's all about certainty. He is a 20th century rhetorical theorist who's actually wanting to think about how it is that we can use rhetoric in more responsible ways. That's the title of this reading: responsible, conscientious ways, right? So for when you think Aristotle or when you think Plato, you should think of like hierarchies, for he's all about like absolute truth, fake truth, like better, worse, right? Very idealist, very much this notion that things are up, down, better, worse. And Weaver's similar, right? So he gives us 4 different kinds of reasoning techniques or styles in this piece: definition, analogy, forget the other 2. And he suggests that you can discern a person's broader thought patterns and even their more sense of morality by the way that they reason. Now, he doesn't get too deep in this reading, but for Weaver, the argument from definition is the ultimate argument, because that's the argument that proceeds from a clarity of principle, right? If you've defined something, if you say privacy is this, or if you say free speech is this, and you define it, then you just deduce from that definition, right? So if you've said free speech is blah, 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 now we enter in a situation where there's a debate. Well, you've got your definition. You've figured out how to proceed because you have this kind of top-down principle. And that's something that Richard Weaver was all about. So for him, there was a major intersection between rhetoric, how we reason, how we argue with one another, how we think, our thought patterns, and what kind of person we are, therefore. In a different set of essays, he talked about the argument from definition as being the argument that defines the conservative worldview, right? It's about principles, it's about consistency, uniformity. And he said that the argument from circumstance, which is the idea that we'll only do if circumstances are favorable, and we won't do it if circumstances aren't favorable. Or it's true if circumstances are favorable, and it's untrue if circumstances aren't favorable. It's this idea of kind of market testing, field testing, get audiences to kind of get a taste of the thing you're talking about, get their opinion, and then decide what you think after the circumstances have told you, right? Weaver thought that was the way that liberals reason, and he thought that was an inferior way of reasoning. So for him, again, the connection between speech, mentality, and morality are important. And he thought that rhetoric was a way for us to better improve, clarify, and to strengthen our ideas and to help us to think more reflectively about the ways that we reason with one another and what we're drawing on, what the sources of our arguments are. Very Platonist. Finally, Burke. He's the most important figure of the modern age, and certainly of the 20th century, and still I think to this day is I think of him as the sort of 20th century Aristotle in terms of the breadth of his intellectual and conceptual contributions to the field. He's hard to pin down. He's not a Platonist because he's not interested in ideals, and he's not interested in certainty. He's not an Aristotelian so much because he's not so interested in the strategies of reasoning and argumentation and topoi and things like that, although he has some kind of an interest in symbolic patterns. I think of him as more sophistic because he's deeply interested in language as such. And as we saw in the Encomium of Helen, there was this embrace of the playfulness of language, the stylistics of the language that Gorgias was using there. Burke was very interested in language, in the way that language itself, sort of independent from our expression of language, but language and the realm of the symbolic, most broadly thought of, how it structures our perceptions and attitudes and values and understandings and so on. No one wrote as brilliantly and as originally as Kenneth Burke did on these kinds of questions. So the definition of man is I find probably the best single reading from Burke on that helps unlock everything else. And the four or five different sort of statements of that definition are great, right? And what you see in Burke is he's a very dialectical thinker. So he says that man is the symbol using but also symbol misusing animal, right? So we use language, but language also uses us. When you think about like your reaction, we just almost won the Stanley Cup here in Las Vegas, so we love our Knights. Right now, if we see someone wearing a Capitals jersey, we're going to be like, "Oh, you suck." We've never met this person, but the symbolic dimension of that encounter affects us even prior to like thought or language or whatever, right? So Burke was fascinating on all that kind of stuff. So let's see. Symbol using, symbol misusing. Inventor of the negative is the inventor of sort of the thou shalt nots, the sense of like, there's this that's proper and correct, and then there's that realm outside, right? The dark zone, the wild, the negative, right? Which is that sense of like bad or opposite or, out of bounds or whatever. Human invented that idea. Rotten with perfection is this idea that like the expression a more perfect union. We're always trying to get a more perfect democracy, a more perfect system of government and polity. We'll never get there, right? But this idea of this like drive for perfection and the rottenness that comes along the way, what do we do in the name of perfection or the name of the ultimate or the ideal? Again, dialectical, right? Perfect but rotten at the same time. Always striving for the ideal, but also corrupt along the way. What else did he say? Goaded by a spirit of hierarchy. Think about, the pursuit of the trophy. Think about, the round robin. Think about the drive for the trophy or the award or the best, whatever. We're always climb. Goaded by a spirit of hierarchy. We're driven by a spirit of hierarchy. And our symbolic dimension in our language carries us along in these enterprises. And there's another one. Separated from our natural condition, from instruments of our own making. If you ever sat in your car and stuck in traffic and your radio's broken and your phone's dead, the battery's dead, you'll feel the spirit of that idea. Like we're separated from our own sort of best state of existence by things that we create that get in the way. Again, dialectical, right? So we're separated from our own selves, from the things that we create. We hear this over and over again today where the internet and phones and everything, we're more connected than ever and also more detached and isolated and separate than ever. That's very Burkean. And Burke was deeply concerned about technology and the march of industry and nuclear warfare as a possibility, right? So think about all these things that we invent that then sort of make our lives even more difficult as a result. All right, so that's already creeping past 23 up to 25. I don't want to go too much longer, so I'll just wrap up there. We can think of Burke as bridging the modern and the postmodern. He was someone who was very interested in good faith sort of social engagements. He wanted to try to improve our language uses. He wanted us to be more self-reflexive about the ways that language uses us and the ways that we get obsessed with symbols, and that symbols drive us crazy. Think about the flag, kneeling at a football game. Think about how much time we spend obsessing over these symbols and these symbolic kinds of questions. And he wanted us to sort of chill out, essentially, to realize that, these are instruments of our own making. But he was postmodern in the sense that language, he understood the power of language itself. He also understood that most of our truths are socially kind of constructed, which is a very postmodern kind of insight. So he kind of teased us up moving forward in the last module, in the last weeks of the class. We'll see the different ways that scholars have taken up Burke's platform and run with it in these different kind of directions. And we'll talk more about the sort of the postmodern and how that filters into rhetoric. But hopefully that's a decent overview in terms of the major themes of this week in this module. And like I said the other day, not seeing a ton of activity from some folks. So if you're out there, making sure that you're getting into stuff, you're doing the reading, you're thinking things through, you're thinking about the paper. We also have our midterm this Friday, so be on the lookout, be prepared for that. That's just going to be multiple choice questions, driven by the concepts, driven by the main sort of broad themes about the four traditions and the major authors and their key concerns. All right, so hope it's going well out there. I'm here, checking the websites pretty regular. So if you have questions or, curiosities or whatever, do let me know. And otherwise, I will chat with you in a few more days. Cheers.